Hello everybody and welcome to this video where I'm going to analyse The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Tennyson. So when I first looked at this poem I was a little bit depressed because I thought, oh, it's just a poem, very simple poem praising the bravery of the soldiers in this battle. And I always think to access the higher grades in an exam you need to be able to see things in a number of different ways to offer alternative interpretations. If you just say, you know, this is used and this is why, it's a very simplistic approach because of course we don't really know, we don't have the poet there to tell us that we're right. But I've put about 10 or 12 hours of study into this poem and I've come up with a couple of different lines of analysis which I think are really useful. So I now think, yeah, this is going to be a really good analysis. Now everything that I say in this video, and you can see it's a long video, comes from my guide, Mr. Bruff's Guide to My Last Duchess and Other Poems. So you don't need to write it all down. You can watch the video and then go and pick up this ebook for £3.99. It contains everything that I'm about to say. So do yourself a favour, pick up a copy, and it really does support me as well. So the first thing we're going to look at is the poet himself, Alfred Lord Tennyson. Now I have made a 30-minute biographical video about Tennyson, which if you click on his picture on the screen, it'll take you to that video if you'd like to know more detailed information. But when we're studying a poem, we really just need to look at the details from a poet's life, which prove important in helping us understand the poem. So for Tennyson and The Charge of the Light Brigade, there are a number of important biographical details to be aware of. Number one, he was born in 1809, died in 1892. This makes him a Victorian poet, and he is the quintessential Victorian poet. He basically lived and died pretty much at the same time as Victoria's reign, and therefore it's often argued that he is the number one Victorian poet. He came from a middle-class family, often suffering with poverty, particularly in the early days of trying to make it as a poet. And he was engaged to a lady called Emily. He did actually end up marrying her, but at one point when he was really poor because of his failures trying to start off as a poet, Emily's father actually forbade the marriage and said, no, you can't, I'm cancelling it, you can't marry her, you're too poor. And I think that's important because there's an underlying sense of criticism of the upper class that we see in Tennyson and his poetry, which certainly would have been heavily influenced by that. In 1850, by this time a very successful, rich, hugely rich poet, I mean a massive celebrity poet at this point, making £10,000 a year from his poetry, which was huge in those days, he was appointed as Poet Laureate. Now this is a role which we still have today, where poets were expected to write verse on occasions of national significance. So obviously The Charge of the Light Brigade was one of those moments and tells us why he perhaps wrote the poem about it. This is a position that he held for the rest of his life. Today the Poet Laureate is just a short role of a number of years. Carol Ann Duffy, the current Poet Laureate, but in this time in Victorian England you served on this role until you died. Critics say that Tennyson had written his best poetry before he was the Poet Laureate, and afterwards he wrote a lot of uninspired verse. Now The Charge of the Light Brigade was written in his role as Poet Laureate, and you can decide for yourself whether you think it's good or not. So those are the important contextual details. Let's talk a little bit now then about the historical context of the Crimean War. Now on the one hand this is really tricky because you're not going to need to write about the war itself in the exam. But the poem is completely rooted in this war, a true story of The Charge of the Light Brigade. So we do need to understand briefly about the Crimean War, and I think the British attitudes towards the Crimean War are important in our understanding of the poem. But I appreciate this bit is a little bit bit like a history lesson, and believe me, I put the hours in, listening to radio shows and podcasts and documentaries about this topic, and you know, I'm going to try and condense it, but it's all in the book, and here we go. So the Crimean War took place between 1853 and 1856. It was a war against Russia. Britain joined in 1854, fighting alongside France, Turkey and Sardinia. Essentially, Russia was trying to take over Romania, and Britain was involved out of fear, because Britain felt that if their power spreads, it could take over India and the Suez Canal, and therefore influence control of our trade routes and our trade with India. So Britain got involved in the war. And it's important to note that it was a very unpopular war. There was public doubt and scepticism as to why the UK was involved, as well as some well-known mistakes being made at the highest levels of command, which frustrated the British public. A bit like the Iraq war that we had recently, there was a sense of, why are we going and getting involved in this war? It's just to do with oil, it's just to do with business, and why are our young people putting their lives at risk for that? Now, the poem focuses on the Battle of Balaclava, and the picture you can see on screen is a sort of a map of it. And that took place on October 24th, 1854. Now, listen, there is a huge amount of speculation as to what exactly happened and why, whose mistake it was, who said what was the order, who was it given to. But let me just give you the sort of overview. During a siege at Sevastopol, the Russians had taken a beating by the British, and they were retreating, they were backing off. But as they were retreating, it became clear they were trying to take or to steal some heavy guns, and the Light Brigade was ordered to ride in to protect the guns. Now, the Light Brigade, as the name suggests, was made up of lightly armoured troops on horseback, and the cavalry were the higher social status soldiers, the section of the army which was the most expensive to get into. This helps us with our understanding of the upper class criticism. You know, so the cavalry were the posh soldiers, partly because those were the only soldiers who could be in the cavalry, because you had to buy your own horse, at least one, you had to buy all the equipment, etc. And as a result, the cavalry were disrespected by many of the working class troops, particularly considering the fact they often didn't get involved in battles. They were led by Lord Lucan, often called Lord Look-on, because it was criticised, look, they never get involved, they never do anything. And that's not their own fault. The stated aim of the cavalry of the Light Brigade was to work as reconnaissance and to mop up defeated opponents. They were not intended to be used for fixed charges. Now, three of the people in charge at the battle were Lord Raglan, Lord Cardigan and Lord Lucan. All three of these men were rich upper-class men who'd bought their way into control, had no real experience at leading war. And this too is important when we look at the criticism of the upper classes that we can possibly interpret in the poem. So Lord Raglan sends the order to the Light Brigade to protect the heavy guns, to ride in and to stop the Russians taking these big guns. But there was a mix-up in communication somewhere between the three leaders, and the Light Brigade instead launched itself at the enemy artillery at the end of the valley. So they went to the wrong place and they charged down through a valley. Because they were in the valley, they couldn't see where they were supposed to go, so they just charged at what they thought they were supposed to charge, and it was the wrong thing. It wasn't a retreating troop. It was the Russians on three sides of the valley with artillery, with guns, shooting at them. And rather than retreat, the Light Brigade kept going. They were committed to it, and they were torn to pieces by the enemy, by gunfire. And they charged in, all 600 or so of them, and even when they got to the end of the valley, those who were still alive, they were faced with Russians who were using musket guns, and they themselves only had their sabres, their swords, and over 150 were killed, with another 150 injured in what was a tragic, futile mission. Now, at the same time, this was a historical period which is now known as the birth of war reporting, and for the very first time, news reporters, for example, from the London Times, were going to the war zones, were writing about the battles, were talking to the soldiers. There was no censorship at this point like there is today. They were literally just writing about what happened. And news of this charge of the Light Brigade went into the newspaper here that we see. This newspaper report is the very one that Tennyson read. And William Howard Russell, writing for the London Times, described the event in November the 14th. And you can see this in the ebook. I've written it all out in there. But essentially, it talks about the blunder, the leadership blunder that led to the death of the soldiers. And it says here, the British soldier will do his duty, even to certain death, and is not paralysed by feeling that he is the victim of some hideous blunder. And this bit here, some hideous blunder, was read by Tennyson, and he said he couldn't get it out of his head, that phrase, hideous blunder. He walked around with that in his head for days, the hideous blunder, because of course the situation is, the Light Brigade, it was a futile mission. They were doomed. You know, it was just a stupid mission. It was a misunderstanding. The leadership, the communication were to blame, and this word blunder stuck in his head, and we do see it in the poem, and he decided to write a poem about it. Now, it's interesting to think about whether this is a positive poem or a negative poem. I'm going to present two lines of inquiry, and they're not mutually exclusive. We could argue that the poem praises the bravery and the honour of the soldiers, but questions and criticises the blunder of leadership, and that's fine. But the whole situation was a PR nightmare. The British public could read the report as a criticism of the blundering upper classes. They basically could come away from it thinking the aristocracy are pointless, they can't get anything right. You know, they've messed this up. And when this story was published in the UK, the public read it and were outraged. In fact, Florence Nightingale, having read the article, decided to go to Crimea and help out. Tennyson too read it and sat down to write this poem, it's argued, in one sitting. And in his role as poet laureate, he might have felt that this is the right thing to do. I need to lift public spirits. I need to praise and honour the bravery of the soldiers. The whole event could be spun into a positive one if the focus was on the bravery and courage of the soldiers, glorious in defeat. Yes, we lost, but we never gave up, and that kind of stiff upper lip of British beliefs and all of that sort of thing. And that actually leaves us with a very simplistic analysis of the poem, praising the bravery of the soldiers. And you may cover this in class. There's lots of words to do with how great they are and you know, all of that sort of thing. But there is another interpretation where we can read the poem as a criticism of the upper classes and a criticism of blind obedience to power. Victorian society was all about hierarchy. You follow the leadership with, you know, you don't question it, and that could be seen to be questioned in the poem. But in the exam, your ability to offer alternative interpretations is key. So in this analysis then, I'm going to look at the poem in terms of the positive, and I'll look at it in terms of the negative, and we'll look at language and structure and form. And most students and teachers and classes analyse language, the importance of the words. So to help you get the high marks in the exam, I'm going to spend most of my analysis looking at form and structure, which are the harder bits that most people struggle with. But before I do that, let me give you a simple translation of what is happening in this poem, a line-for-line translation. So a league is 1.5 miles. So what I'll do is I'll put you can see each verse on the screen. 6 verses, not a coincidence. There were 600 soldiers, 1 verse for each 100. I'll just tell you what it means. So this first verse is basically saying 1.5 miles, 1.5 miles. We've got to go on another 1.5 miles. We are in near-death danger. As 600 soldiers, the Light Brigade, are riding here. We were told to move forward and take the guns. Into almost certain death rode the 600. Verse 2 is really saying the cavalry was told to move forward. Was anyone afraid? No. Even though they knew someone had made a mistake in giving the order, it wasn't their job to speak back. It wasn't their job to question the order. Their job was to win or to die trying. So they rode into near certain death. Next verse really means that there were cannons to the right of them and the left of them and in front of them, and the cannons were shooting at them, and the soldiers were being viciously attacked, but rode bravely and rode well into, again, almost certain death, into complete despair. The soldiers rode. Verse 4, essentially saying that their swords were flashing in the sunlight once they'd reached the end and were actually fighting the soldiers. They swung their swords at the enemy soldiers. They charged at the enemy while everyone wondered, and this word wondered is ambiguous. I'm going to come to that later. They rode through the cannon smoke through the line of waiting enemy soldiers, and the enemy soldiers, that's the Russians and also their allies, the Cossacks, fell about when attacked with swords. They were broken and split apart, and then the Light Brigade returned back. They retreated, but not all 600 who had rode out. This verse saying there were now cannons on their right and left and behind them because they were retreating, and as the cannons shot at them, the soldiers were viciously attacked. Soldiers and their horses fell dead, coming back from the brink of certain death, back from the place of utter destruction, all that was left of them, left of the original 600. And the final verse saying, when will we stop marvelling at them? Oh, the amazing thing they did. Everybody was in awe of them. We should honour what they did, honour the whole Light Brigade, the wonderful 600. That's pretty much what the poem means, just in case you're sat there thinking, I don't get it, which is often a very valid answer when we're looking at poetry. So let's begin with the form. Now, this poem is a ballad. The ballad is a historic form of poetry which often used to be sung. It's a poem which tells a story and it contains a refrain. A refrain is like the chorus of a song, a line which is repeated regularly throughout the poem. And in The Charge of the Light Brigade, the refrain could be argued is the use of 600 at the end of each verse. There's a sense with ballads that if there's an important story to be told and you want it to pass on for future generations, you write it into a ballad. And the form has medieval roots where storytellers would use the musicality of the refrain to help others remember the stories they were telling. So as I said, they're important stories associated with histories, in other words, things you should never forget. And the use of the ballad form therefore suggests there's an element of folklore to the Charge of the Light Brigade, and that it is an awe-inspiring act of bravery which should be passed on to future generations, that we should never forget these soldiers and how brave they were, and we should always honour them, and therefore the use of the ballad form makes sense. However, it's equally valid to say that Tennyson wanted the public not just to never forget the bravery of the soldiers, but also to never forget the stupidity of the aristocratic leadership and the blunder that ultimately caused the whole thing to take place. So it can also be read not only as a tale of praise and the soldiers to be proud of, but using the ballad form in the sense of it being a cautionary tale, that we should never forget the error that made this happen. So I'm writing it as a ballad so that we will, like a ballad, pass it on from generation to generation, so that we don't make the same mistakes again in terms of leadership and communication and who we put in charge. Remember, many of these lords had never really seen battle. They were just in charge because they bought their way into that senior position. So whether it's the positive or the negative, the ballad form works well. Now, by far the most impressive element of the poem comes in its use of dactylic dimeter. This is pretty tricky to explain, and in an exam, just so you know, you don't need to explain what it is, you just need to explain why it's used. So I'll spend a couple of minutes explaining what it is, but in the exam you would just say that, Tennyson uses dactylic dimeter here because. You wouldn't say dactylic dimeter is, and because you've got to assume the examiner knows what it is. So let me explain it to you. If you look at these lines, forward the Light Brigade, was there a man displayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Now, when we talk about meter, we're talking about which syllables in a line are stressed, which ones are emphasized more than the others. And as you can see, the syllables in bold are the ones we stress. For, light, was, man, not, soul, some, blun, theirs, make, theirs, re, theirs, do. So, and if you read that out loud yourself, you'll see that. So the stressed syllables come at the start and the middle of each line, followed by mostly two syllables which are unstressed or perhaps less stressed. And once we've worked out the stress, we can look at something called the feet. There are only 6 types of feet in English poetry: iamb, trochee, spondee, dactyl, anapest, and pyrrhic. and a dactyl is made up of one stressed syllable followed by two unstressed syllables. So this is a dactyl that you can see on the screen. This is the use of dactyls. If we break the poem up with the forward slashes, you can see that each line is made up of two dactylic feet. And when there are 2 feet per line, we call that a dimeter. So the poem is written in dactylic dimeter. That's about as complex as poetry analysis gets. But the big question is why? In your exams, guys, it's not enough to just identify poetic techniques as if you're showing off that you know what they are. You get no marks for that. We have to link them to the meaning. Why is Tennyson going to what is clearly a lot of effort to write in dactylic dimeter? Well, in the positive interpretation of the poem, where we see Tennyson's aim as being to create awe at the bravery of the soldiers, the use of dactylic dimeter is fairly simple to explain. Tennyson wants us to fully appreciate the bravery of the soldiers, to feel as if we were there on the battlefield with them. If we can feel as if we were there on the battlefield with them, then we're going to be able to empathise with them and understand and appreciate their bravery to a higher level. So the dum-de-dum, the dum-de-de-dum-de-de-dum-de-de-dum-de-de-dum meter of dactylic dimeter mirrors the galloping hoofbeats of the horses, and there is a sense the poem sounds like the battle. The use of sound in this poem is very clever. I'll come back to it later. Now, Tennyson, interestingly, just as an aside here, actually recorded himself reading this poem. One of the earliest recordings ever made in 1890. It was recorded onto wax, so it's available to listen to, but it's very crackly. But I was listening to it yesterday. One of the interesting things is that he starts reading very slowly, and he speeds up his pace as he reads through the poem. And this use of speed of reading, when coupled with a dactylic dimeter which reflects the sound of horses' hooves, reflects the fact that the soldiers on their horses would have started off at a slow trot. Remember, they had a couple of miles to get down the valley, and they actually did speed up at the end, the war reporter said, even though they knew by this point they were doomed. So we could say that the use of dactylic dimeter echoes the hoofbeats of the horses and adds energy and pace to the poem, and that combines to help the reader empathise with the situation the soldiers found themselves in, and therefore to feel that they're more, really amazing people. We also call it a falling rhythm, though, with 2 unstressed syllables following the stressed syllables, and the falling rhythm could be argued to reflect the falling soldiers as well. Now, there is one line that does not conform to dactylic dimeter, and that is the line, "someone had blundered." The word blundered falls short of the metrical rule because there's only 1 syllable after the first blun, and there should be 2. So, "someone had blundered" is clearly an important line, and we know it was this word blundered that was taken from the original news report, and we know that Tennyson had it stuck in his head, and the blunder seemed to be what influenced him writing the poem. So what is he doing? He's emphasising the blunder. He is criticising the leadership error which led to this practically suicidal mission taking place. And he's subtly drawing our attention to the mistake. The word blunder means stupid or careless mistake. By deliberately breaking the rules of his chosen poetic structure, Tennyson is subtly drawing the reader's attention to his disgust at the blunder that caused the fatalities. He had to do it subtly, as dictated by his role of poet laureate, but it is there. We can also say the dactyls create the sense of the horses galloping forwards, but this 4th line is shorted, and that mirrors how the dramatic stop, the shortening, mirrors the dramatic stop and shortening of the soldiers' lives who are about to die. So that's very clever, isn't it? This is the sort of thing I love about this poem. Let's just go through some things about language to finish up then. You can analyse the language of the poem to varying degrees of complexity. You can say, oh, there's a lot of language to do with bravery, he's honouring the soldiers. But I think let's try and look at some more sophisticated lines of analysis. There are a number of biblical references within the poem. The Valley of Death is referenced. That, of course, refers to Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. You might also think of the Coolio song, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I take a look at my life and realise there's nothing left. Either one is valid, but it is clear, and Victorian audiences would have noticed the biblical reference here, that there's some biblical imagery. And by putting it in the first verse, we can say that it's important that Tennyson is trying to immediately bring in biblical imagery to show its significance. So, what does the biblical imagery do? Well, there are a couple of things. It highlights the almost awe-inspiring nature of the soldiers' bravery, that it's almost biblical in its kind of the way we should respect it and what they did. There's also a reference to David and Goliath, though. It was King David who wrote Psalm 23, talking about the valley of the shadow of death. The battle of David and Goliath took place in a valley. The battle of the Light Brigade, the charge of the Light Brigade, took place in a valley. So it's significant that both took place in a valley, and both contained an underdog taking on a powerful enemy. David takes on Goliath, the Light Brigade take on the Russian artillery and soldiers. So the biblical imagery is a literary allusion to the story, not only of Psalm 23, but also perhaps to David and Goliath, highlighting the bravery of the soldiers. One of the poetic devices used is repetition. There's not to make reply, there's not to reason why, there's but to do and die. And when poets repeat something, it's because they really want it to stick in our head. So the repetition here is Tennyson's way of saying, look, this is an important part of the poem. And why is that? What is he saying? Well, we do need to understand something of Victorian culture to appreciate these lines fully. You see, in Victorian England, there was a value for order and obedience to hierarchy. And we see this in the soldiers, but we can't be sure that this blind obedience is being praised. Tennyson can be seen to mourn the absence of individual freedom in the armed forces, questioning the unfailing obedience which they have. Again, it's almost like they're charging into gunfire. They know, look, there's a mistake here, we're going to die, but it's not their job to question it. They've just got to do it. And that isn't a positive, is it? That's not, oh, that's brilliant. They messed up, there was a big mistake, but at least they did what they were told. Okay, they were brave and they kept going, but there should have been a sense of this kind of, freedom in the armed forces, to not just let some posh lord who's in charge, who's never fought a battle in his life, but bought his way into leadership, tell you, go and do that, and you have to do it. Now, let's finish up with what is probably the most amazing thing in the poem. There are a number of ambiguous language choices within the poem, which you can interpret in both the positive and the negative way. The most significant of these is the use of the word wondered in the line, all the world wondered. In the positive analysis, we can interpret this word to mean to admire or to be amazed by. In other words, everyone was awestruck by the bravery of the soldiers. That's, to wonder, like, as in, that was amazing. But the word wondered has a secondary meaning too. It can be to question, I wonder why they did that. And with this definition in mind, we can see the line can be interpreted to mean the whole world is questioning how such a stupid mistake could have been made. Now, both interpretations are valid, but isn't it great how Tennyson's choice of words allows so many different interpretations? And there's another thing to say about wondered. You see, many words in the poem create a sense of sound. Thundered, shattered, sundered, blundered, wondered. And there's an almost drum-like beat created through reading the poem, and this echoes the sort of speed and the pace and the sound of the horses thundering along. But there's something else to be said. Now, the Oxford professor Matthew Bevis, in the book The Oxford Handbook of British and War Poetry, came up with a really good idea. And it's amazing, the power of the internet. I emailed him yesterday, said, can I just use this in my ebook and video? And within 10 minutes he wrote back and said yes. So his idea is that all of these words are used because of the bit that we see in orange here, the use of the erd sound, and its phonetic similarity to the word ERR, and erd, ERRED, i.e. to make an error, to do something wrong. So throughout the poem there's a subtle reminder that a mistake was made, that somebody erred, that there was an error made. Now, as I said, this isn't my idea, this is the Oxford professor's idea, because I can imagine some people thinking, oh, that's too far-fetched. But this is a great idea, that it's a reminder there was an error made, somebody erred, somebody made an error, and I think that's great. And the final thing to mention is that the use of the word wondered contains both the positive and the negative interpretation. And this again from Matthew Bevis. This is a direct quote from his book. It also carries within it, this is the word wondered, the sound of the poem's pride for the men in won, as in WON. They won because even though they lost the battle, there was the pride in what they did, alongside its awareness of the pointlessness of their death in erd. So in this one word, wondered, you can say there's the positive and the negative interpretation. The one is the positive, the erd is the negative. That's from Matthew Bevis, the Oxford Handbook of British and Irish War Poetry, 1997, Oxford University Press, if you fancy picking it up. Really, really clever. So that's the end of the analysis. I hope you found it useful. Now, guys, please do subscribe to the channel. Please do pick up the ebook. I've got a podcast on iTunes to listen to. I've got 15 revision guides on Amazon and mrbruff.com. But, as you can see, this is a big video, so thanks for sticking with it. I hope you found it useful.